theories. At the time, I was interested in Dupuy's role in founding the CREA, one of the first laboratories of cognitive sciences in France and in the world, and in his participation to the group of 10, who was composed of other famous French intellectuals, all involved in different ways in the development of a personal complexity theory, inspired from cybernetics and systemics, but at the same time critical of them. In order to prepare this webinar, I had the pleasure to explore Dupuy's work about liberalism. Today, he is going to focus more on the concept of artificialization of life through the example of NBIC convergence. Time is short, I know, but if during your speech you want, each one of you want to put the basis of a dialogue with the other speaker, please feel free. Thomas, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can see me now. I'm going to attempt now to share slides. So let me see how this works. Can everyone see my first slide?
Yep.
Or...
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so this work stems a little bit from my PhD thesis, but it's been ongoing. I was lucky enough to visit the RAND archives in 2017, which at RAND's relatively newer office on Main Street near Venice Beach in Los Angeles, and it's a very kind of incongruous location. There's surfers and people pumping weights on Muscle Beach nearby, and you get a strange sense of the geography of RAND. It's somehow between this kind of vaudevillian world of Californian beach life and the kind of conventional history of RAND as this Cold War strategic institution that is most famously associated with the ideas of Herman Kahn. But in the short time that I have to speak to you, I want to talk to you about a later RAND, the RAND Corporation in the 1970s, rather than the RAND Corporation of Herman Kahn in the 1950s. RAND is obviously not normally a place that's associated with energy saving. Energy saving, as this nice cartoon shows, is in the 1970s often a cause that is associated with the counterculture. In his book, Fred Turner argues that hippie communes and alternative technologies essentially went mainstream, and that by the end of the 1970s, most Americans tried to conserve and recycle their waste. But I want to focus a little bit on an earlier period than that depicted in this cartoon. I want to focus on the pre-oil crisis period from around 1960 to around 1969, to around 1972, before the Middle Eastern oil embargo and price rises of October 1973. So one author that I found helpful to think about this period is the historian of nuclear power, Thomas Wellock, who argues that in the 1970s, specifically in California, something called the Aquarian takeover took place. And he argues that by the 1980s, a new generation had taken power in California, and they positioned themselves against technocratic state power and its most kind of significant totem at that moment, which was the Sun Desert nuclear power plant. And in its place, these Californian Aquarians introduced legislation which replaced the plan for nuclear power plants instead with forecasts for the rate at which energy could be saved in the future. And so what does RAND have to do with all of this? The organization is more conventionally, as I mentioned, associated with the Cold War. It's known as a secretive and somehow boring organization, somehow connected to the US Air Force and effectively satirized by Stanley Kubrick in his Dr. Strangelove, where it was dubbed the Bland Corporation. I want to argue that RAND's proximity to Hollywood is not incidental. In fact, when RAND became a non-profit research institution in 1948, Its salmon pink modernist office on Santa Monica's Main Street was designed by an architect called Harold Roy Kelly. And during the war, Kelly had worked for Douglas Aircraft. There, a consistently warm climate, cheap real estate, and federal subsidies dating from the New Deal era had meant that California had become the aerospace capital of the US gun belt. Aerospace Alley, an agglomeration of airplane and affiliated industries, stretched from Malibu to Newport Beach. And it was there that during the war, Kelly was commissioned to build a structure that suspended 5 million square feet of chicken wire across 400 high poles, towering above Douglas's Santa Monica aircraft factory. On this canvas, underemployed Hollywood set designers created a burlap sack simulation, building a sparsely populated suburbia filled with fake trees and fake houses. This extravagant camouflage was intended to deter Japanese bombing raids. Because Douglas was an obvious target, under this chicken wire simulation, a team of scientists were working on behalf of the US Air Force in pursuit of an optimal configuration of variables for the deployment of the B-29 Superfortress airplane. Calculating a vast number of variations in armor cladding, bomb payload, and fuel efficiency, these scientists sought to maximize the efficacy of B-29 bombing raids over Japan. The B-29's high-pressure, highly efficient engines allowed these 140,000-pound planes to cross 3,000 miles over the Pacific, stopping only to refuel on the terraformed islands of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, which had been largely flattened to create a series of runways and refueling bays in the middle of the ocean, allowing the B-29s to fill up before heading on to Japan and dropping incendiaries specifically designed to ignite the delicate wood and paper buildings of Japan. The optimization of B-29 bombing campaigns was one of the first logistical problems that the US Air Force described in terms of complexity, and it was formulated in abstract systemic terms. The term system here denoted an effort to be more comprehensive than the traditional operations research studies. Systems analysts sought to consider all factors affecting a complex problem. In the context of strategic air war, a system meant, I quote, all the interrelated economic and strategic considerations associated with a problem's development. As Rand's first biographer, Bruce Smith, would note, the systematization of reality was not an easy task. Reality, more often than not, exceeded those simulations of their complexity. Smith wrote, "It's clear there are systems within systems. Reality does not divide itself neatly into self-evident categories for the analyst's convenience. Consequently, like any intellectual endeavor, the system study must take great care to define the parameters of the subject it proposes to analyze." So this first iteration of systems analysis, carried out under the chicken wire, involved a cast of mathematicians and scientists, including the soon-to-be inventor of the semiconductor, Bill Shockley. The scientists crunched a vast number of sums looking to optimize the efficacy of bombing, a wicked problem in all senses. Those working on this problem, who, at the request of the Air Force General Henry Happy Arnold, would form the nucleus of the later RAND Corporation, and they would extend the rigorous problem-solving methods developed for the B-29 to other domains, from the development of satellites to meteorology and the establishment of a near-continuous orbit of B-52 bombers during the Cold War, intended to act to maintain the delicate balance of terror, as RAND analyst Albert Wohlstetter phrased it. But as Cold War became détente, RAND sought to apply its methods to policy. By the late 1960s, this remit was extended once more to problems of the environment. And so it was that in 1970, under the banner of the National Science Foundation's new Research Applied to National Needs program, the tools of systems analysis would find themselves applied to the problem of energy demand. Dean Morris, a former aerodynamics and ballistics researcher, would lead RAND's 10-person energy policy team, and he recognized the incompatibility of forecasted energy demand rates with the need, I quote, to restore and preserve the quality of the environment. The RAND Growing Demand for Energy study was intended to analyze the development of power systems, defined as within a total system, which meant the interrelation of resources, technology, society, and the biosphere upon which the whole enterprise depended. The RAND project had three goals. First, to identify and quantify factors which determine demand, then to develop methods of relating these factors, and third, to use this data and its relations to create a family of models to account for alternative policies and uncertain future events. So the head of RAND's Environmental Services Department, the geophysicist Stanley Greenfield, had been sufficiently concerned by Soviet scientist Mikhail Budikov's work on heat pollution that he had attempted to calculate his own estimates of thermal energy waste at a planetary scale. In December 1970, he qualified these efforts because of the crudeness of most existing energy demand projections, most of which relied almost exclusively on pure extrapolation. But however crude, Greenfield's estimate revealed an untenable situation. The amount of global energy that was wasted thermally was estimated to increase by 5.7% per year, not only altering Earth's climate, but creating more than 31 million megawatts of wasted energy by the year 2000. Greenfield's second observation was that such forecasts tended to be self-fulfilling. Given the lead time required to build hardware such as power plants, their construction could begin as much as 15 years before power was needed. 15 years later, with extra power available, this electrical energy would inevitably be consumed. So in the succinct prose that RAND publications are characteristic of, Greenfield argued that projected demand leads to the creation of forecast capacity. Such forecasts were, in a sense, performative. So in 1971, a mathematician working at RAND, a guy called Fred Roberts, who Jean-Pierre may be interested to know is a student of the AI pioneer, Dana Scott. And Roberts would attempt to develop a new model of energy demand. And he was a combinatorics specialist who was adept at modeling finite structures. And he proposed to use a branch of this mathematics called graph theory to understand energy demand as an outcome of a dynamic of interrelated dependencies, rather than, as in prior forecasts, a linear system of supply and demand. Of course, such graph theoretical renderings of energy demand systems, so the energy demand system we have here, had a long history. Perhaps the earliest we can think of is the 1763 approach of the mathematician Leonhard Euler, who had used such thinking to try and find the shortest route over the 7 bridges of Königsberg, a trivial problem, of course. But Euler had began the development of topological methods for optimizing decisions in a physically constrained world. Roberts' aim was to use a similarly constrained topology to model the constraints acting on the energy economy. He suggested that all the major determinants of energy demand should be represented as nodes, related to other nodes via their edges, and these edges would be directional insofar as a node's agency acted upon a specific node, and a variation in its value would have a quantitative effect on the value of another node, either positive or negative. The energy demand digraphs that he created were related to other techniques for analyzing systems, such as simultaneous equations, input-output analysis, linear difference equations. But digraphs, Roberts believed, had a psychological benefit over these methods, as they represented relations in an intuitive and visual way. Moreover, he theorized that adding new nodes or new feedback loops, or changing the value of signs or edges, could offer a precise way to generate new forms of energy policy. So rather than drawing on the conventional cybernetic notion of homeostasis, Roberts had described his work in terms of second cybernetics, not to be mistaken with second-order cybernetics. The study of second cybernetics meant the study of systems that amplified deviation from a given condition. Japanese analyst Magura Maruyama had published a paper in 1963 which had argued that analysts had focused for too long on deviation-reducing systems, and this was a mistake given the ubiquity of deviation amplifying systems, not least those systems of capital accumulation, evolution, and erosion. So Maruyama had later attributed his thinking to the Japanese art of flower arrangement, ikebana, the simplicity of form, reflecting on the simplicity of the underlying network diagrams in his analysis. And in an energy system, this approach meant that a majority of negative feedbacks would mean growth in energy demand would reduce as deviations were counteracted, whereas a majority of positive feedbacks would mean that deviations are amplified and energy demand would increase. So for Roberts, despite this gloss of novelty, I can't help thinking that his approach was distinctly first cybernetics, as the objective was to work against deviation in energy demand by developing an increasingly homeostatic energy demand system. So after Roberts' simple schematic models, another RAND researcher, a guy called Ronald Doctor, led a team creating a computational version of the model. The aim was to present California's energy system in lines of code and carry out a time-stepping procedure to simulate the state's energy use behavior over time. Researchers gathered a vast range of data describing the state's economy, its climate, and its population. It was then programmed and written in Fortran and ran on an IBM 360/65. The model represented California's energy demand as a set of industrial, commercial, and agricultural submodels. Residential energy demand, for example, was calculated as a function of demography, electrical appliance saturation, climate, housing type, the cost of electricity, and the way in which it was priced. Variations in appliance use were also simulated based on energy efficiency, use rates, and the ownership levels of technologies such as air conditioners, televisions, or even electronic carving knives. All was done with the aim of representing the energy system's dynamics with sufficient realism so that alternative energy policies could be tested in silico. Each run of the model cost just 64 kilobytes of processing power and could be carried out in 32 CPU seconds, meaning running the model was relatively quick and relatively inexpensive. Now, every operation of an energy-efficient appliance in every home, factory, or office could be modeled, and each could be cast as a deviation-countering sub-process, insofar as these devices could be modeled as more efficient than the device they replaced. Each more efficient appliance could therefore act to stabilize rather than increase the overall electrical demand rate. So, taken on aggregate, this model showed that California could end up using 196 billion less kilowatt hours than previous forecasts had predicted. More dramatic still, the model demonstrated how such reductions in energy use could occur at no expense to economic growth. Doctor and his colleagues devised scenarios which showed how California's electrical demand rate could increase while not affecting the total utility, could decrease, while not affecting the total utility derived from electricity. Using gas in place of electricity, insulation, or improving electronic appliances efficiencies were small-scale interventions which would not interfere with the market, the electrical market's own allocative capacities. And on aggregate, they estimated, it was believed that annual increases in electrical demand could be reduced from 5 to 3%, eradicating the need for over 100 power plants by the year 2000. One Californian assemblyman called the report political dynamite. It entirely undermined the existing demand accommodation energy policy, and on the basis of this model, Doctor proposed that California should create a new Office of Energy Conservation, and arguably this helped California to become, in per capita terms, the most energy efficient of US states. But what followed? California's total energy demand continues to rise, and as Carter was replaced by Reagan, the budget for federally funded energy research flatlined. RAND researchers became increasingly critical of their past simulation work. MIT mathematician and RAND model maker David Lineweber wrote in 1980 of how such models had grown in complexity as a shield. Ever greater numbers of arithmetic operations had hidden the underlying uncertainties regarding socio-political, economic, and environmental data. Economics, Lineweber noticed, is not physics, and it never will be. Increasing complexity had not increased model accuracy, and in fact, no effort had been made to verify the veracity of such forecasts. Energy conservation savings had been assumed rather than accounted for. So Lineweber would write another paper for RAND that year, and he would argue that a cybernetic conception of the energy system inevitably led one to make the case for liberalizing energy markets. As energy became more expensive and information cheaper, he suggested that up-to-the-minute electricity pricing using information technologies, or what were referred to as microprocessors at the time, could, he argued, create major efficiency improvements in the conservation and productivity of electrical power. According to his later book, Nerds on Wall Street, energy research then lost its prestige in the 80s. Oil prices returned to pre-crisis levels, and Lineweber would leave RAND to become a quant, developing the trading dashboard MarketMind. So, interestingly, in Nerds on Wall Street, Lineweber would describe his work at RAND as having done AI-inspired analysis of econometric models for the Department of Energy. Energy conservation, understood in this systemic network way, as it had been conceived of at RAND, is now a central part of global strategy for climate change mitigation. And its acceptance marks the extrapolation of cybernetics and systems analytics to the energy economy as a whole, and with it, the Earth system within which it is enveloped. So despite the importance of this task, little is done to address whether such conservation savings are achieved in practice, and if so, at which scale. And the bigger question is there any correlation between the increased complexity of these demand accommodation models and increased savings of energy? So that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I will stop sharing. Hopefully.
Thank you, Tom. Was very interesting. Jean-Pierre, and we will open up the questions after your talk.
Well, it's you are the heads, huh? You are the directors of this. But don't you think we should discuss Thomas's paper now? No?
Pablo, what do you think?
I would suggest, I agree with Jean-Pierre, what we can do is take a few, let's say, technical questions or understanding questions on Thomas. So let's say 5 minutes, and then we go to Jean-Pierre and we have the general discussion afterwards, if you agree with that. So are there some on the chat, please? It's easier. Some questions about Tom's talk, or maybe Fabrizio, you want to start as you want. I just maybe some a question. Can you repeat maybe the main argument? What was the precise mechanism that allowed to go from 5 to 3% of energy consumption? What is, because my obsession, let's say, with formal models is always for forecasting. Okay, the use of formal models for forecasting is that they discover some new insight or new concept, or is it mere logistics in some sense? Combining very trivial and known elements, but the combination is too difficult for our minds. So, I mean, by combining things formally, you discover new effects, or do they conceptualize something new? So I missed maybe the precise way that these digraphs manage to find a way out of the 5% and go to the 3%. Maybe you can repeat this argument until we get new questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Pablo. Yeah, it's essentially the same thing as optimizing the B-29 bombing campaigns. It's almost a linear programming problem where you try so many iterations of the problem, and you work out, okay, what is the scenario, what is the model run wherein we can reduce overall energy demand, reduce the demand rate without having a marked effect on the economy. And I think that the diagraph, maybe I share my screen quickly. The diagraph is important insofar as it sort of rendered the energy system as this closed informational system, insofar as an increase in the number of factories would have an amplifying effect on the number of jobs, or an increase in energy use would increase. So it's this idea that the system of energy demand suddenly becomes this closed system of feedbacks. And Robert's point is the way in which that's structured, which is a little bit, to me, when in my analysis of this, the way in which that's structured is this very cybernetic idea of form more important than the variables within a system of feedbacks. And in Jean-Pierre's book, he writes about how cyberneticists are interested in form rather than physicists who are interested in actual quantities of energy and matter. And I think this reformulation of the energy system, even if it's just a reformulation conceptually rather than physically, is central to that reconceptualization, or that forecasting of the system as something which results in only 3% annual growth rather than 5%.
But still, okay, so I mean, okay, I'm still not completely sure that I understand. I mean, is it enough to describe the system at this macro level? I mean, without any detail, enough to go from 5 to 3? And what about the real power of this forecast? I mean, how? And maybe last question is it possible to? I mean, is the reason buried in the complex program, like in artificial intelligence now? I mean, it's what you call now the interpretability of these formal models. I mean, can you give the reason in a human way, or do you need to go into the program to understand the result?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you can give the program, as the simulation, as I mentioned, went into very close detail, you know, even looking at each television and air conditioner and the increasing efficiency of these appliances. But essentially the logic is just that there's an increase in the number of negative feedbacks within the energy systems, or at least in the way in which the energy system is being modeled, which dampens the growth rate in electrical energy demand. So it's a kind of it's a deviation is no longer amplified in the system when you have a significant number of negative feedback. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of basic schematic underlying this decoupling mechanism. But the way in which that's quantified then relies on this model and the quantitative data that goes into it.
Okay. Yeah, you have to dive into the program. Okay, thanks. So, I mean, I don't see any precise question in the chat, so maybe we can move on to Jean-Pierre and leave more time for discussion. Okay?
Yes.
Okay. So start video. Yeah. So maybe you see me now, but the share window is not lit, Pablo. Okay, now it is. And so application, I suppose, huh? They ask me whether I want to share the screen or the application.
Application, yes.
Application, okay.
I'll tell you if it's okay.
Application window. I think it's going to be okay. Yeah.
Great. Okay, it's working.
Okay.
Yep. Great.
Good. Yeah, just 2 words about Thomas's very rich paper. It speaks to my, not only to my mind, but to my life. It's about California, Bodega Bay and Hitchcock, the birds, blackouts and brownouts. I did that all the time. Daniel Ellsberg. I don't know if his paper has been, you distributed it? You
Yes, there is a paper on the web page of our.
So everyone read it, I suppose. No, okay. But I want to signal certainly one of the most beautiful typos I've ever come across. So it's about Euler's problem, you know, the 7 bridges of Königsberg, etc. So the typo is the following: the shortest route over the 7 brides of Königsberg. Oh my God, poor Euler, eh? His wedding night must have been very harrowing, even though it was the shortest route. That's beautiful. Okay. So the topic was proposed to me by Fabrizio. He said, from cybernetics to complexity. And I just added and back. Okay, from cybernetics to complexity and back to cybernetics. First part is cybernetics and the artificialization of nature and life. So I have to go very, very fast. And I won't repeat a number of basic things. I want just to signal that the 3 major characters or protagonists of that story, in my mind, are the 3 guys you see on this slide. The most famous one, unfortunately, is Norbert Wiener, who gave its name to cybernetics. I'm not sure it was the most interesting. John von Neumann was one of the, Norbert Wiener was a mathematician. John von Neumann also was certainly one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, for better or for worse, because we owe him, well, first automata theory, and as a consequence, the computer, as we know it. Actually, the machine I have in front of my eyes was very often called a John von Neumann machine, along with the British, of course, Alan Turing. But he was also the inventor of game theory, of in a sense, the theory of games, etc., etc. And also, he made a computation for the A bomb and, above all, for the H bomb. Warren McCulloch, he was, for me, the mastermind of the whole thing. Initially, he was a neuropsychiatrist, and he became a logician, essentially a logician. And this happened during the so-called Macy conferences that lasted from, I mean, there were two conferences every year from 1946 to 1953. That was the birthplace of cybernetics. Cybernetics, what was its goal? It was to construct a scientific, that is, a physicalist theory of the mind. And they thought they could resolve in that way the ancient philosophical problem of mind and matter. Their watchword was naturalizing the mind. So cybernetics was a form of monism, but not in the traditional meaning of the same substance. No, everything, according to them, was subject to the same principles of organization: nature, life, and the mind. And now it happens that the principles of organization supposed to be common to everything that exists in the universe were, for them, mechanistic principles based on a device that processes information according to fixed rules, what we call an algorithm, and more particularly the Turing machine, the concept of which was formulated by Turing in 1936. So for these guys, the naturalization of the mind merged with the mechanization of the mind. And that's a title, or rather the subtitle of my book, to which Thomas referred a moment ago, or the subtitle here, On the Origin of Cognitive Science, the Mechanization of the Mind. Okay. So for these guys, if the mind is but one with nature, that is because nature has been interpreted as if it were a product of the mind. Huh? Because a machine, a Turing machine, is a product of the human mind, of course. This feat, if it is a feat, is reminiscent of the a trick that the famous, the famous Swiss clown Grock, his heydays were in the 50s, 1950s. So he was an excellent pianist. He would climb on stage, walk towards the piano, discover that the stool was far away from the piano, and he would strain to move the piano in order to draw it closer to the stool. Everyone was laughing, of course. It would have been so simple to push the stool closer to the piano. So in this metaphor, the piano is nature and the stool, the mind. The reconceiving of nature in terms that could lead one to believe it were a creation of the mind is what makes it possible to say that the mind has been brought closer to nature. And hence the expression in the form of an oxymoron, nature has become artificial nature. The two foundational articles of the new discipline were, first, Norbert Wiener's, and also two important guys, Julian Bigelow and Arturo Rosenbluth, Behavior, Purpose, and Teleology, 1943. And that's where they introduced the concept of feedback. The second article was by Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts, another genius of mathematics who unfortunately died very young. Same date, 1943. And it's in this article that they formulated for the first time the concept of neural network, which is central to today's artificial intelligence, and which was dismissed after a number of years, maybe 10 years by, I don't want to get into that story, the history of artificial intelligence. And those two notions, feedback and concept, I should say, and neural network are mechanisms that simulate. That's a very important word in cybernetics. To simulate is at the same time to model, to create a mathematical model, but it's also to make believe. So both feedback and neural network simulate intentionality and finality. Actually, before they chose the name cybernetics for the new discipline that happened in 1948, the cyberneticians used the catchword teleological mechanisms. Teleological mechanisms. At the time, it sounded like an oxymoron. What they meant to say was that machines can behave as though they were pursuing a goal. First of all, a goal that their designer had set for them, but also, and that was the ultimate ambition, the goal that the machines seem to have set for themselves. The idea of an autonomous machine. Second part. So complexity now, and the concept of natural machine, as opposed to artificial machine. One of the most outstanding conceptual breakthroughs of the second half of the 20th century, it seems to me, was the emergence and the development of the notion of natural machine. And my thesis in my work and in this short talk today is that the current dynamics of technoscience thrives on the corruption and decomposition of that idea. And the ethical and political implications are momentous. Natural machine. Well, the reader of Descartes may react here to what she may take as an anachronism. Obviously, there was no need to wait for the 20th century to treat nature and life as if they were machines. But the confusion must be avoided at all costs here. One must not confuse the metaphysics that treats nature and life as artificial machines on the one hand, that is, machines that have been designed by an artificer, a maker, a designer, in which case we remain caught in a traditional form of finalism or teleology. It's a teleology of the maker. We must not confuse artificial machine with a metaphysics that treats machines as natural machines, that is, that dispenses altogether with the conscious designer, be it God, the gods, or nature itself. The theory of complex self-organizing systems that emerged in the wake of cybernetics and to a large extent in reaction to it permits us to give full consistency to the concept of a complex machinery such as life without a designer. By the way, Thomas, I don't think you can respond now because your micro must be muted, but I was intrigued by the fact that you distinguished between second cybernetics and second order cybernetics. You'll have to tell me more about that, because for me, they are the same thing. And the second order or second cybernetics or cybernetics of cybernetics was founded by a great friend of mine, late friend of mine, of course, Heinz von Förster, who was the scientific secretary of the Macy conferences. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, and just I would add, Jean-Pierre, since you mentioned that, we will also take advantage of the presence of Andy Pickering also here with us, because he also distinguishes between the American and the British cybernetics. And I think that his British cybernetics are quite different from the American ones. But let's keep that point until, we can discuss a little bit of the past of cybernetics and these historical debates.
Yeah, I'm thinking of mainly of the American cybernetics, because I could talk about the French brand of cybernetics, but I won't do it today.
Okay.
So a short history of what happened. The maverick man in the Macy conferences was, as I said before, John von Neumann, who died young, as you can see, at the age of 54, of awful cancer of the bones cancer. Okay, so I'm going to skip a number of things that happened in the framework of a conference that took place at the Caltech, a so-called Hickson Symposium in 1948. That was still the heydays of cybernetics. And that's where he formulated a conjecture on complexity. But I'm going to skip this and go directly to the essence of the matter. A complex machine, which he called an automaton, is capable, by definition, of bringing about something more complex than itself, its own behavior. Is complex something that is capable of bringing something more complex than itself? This is called a recursive definition. That is a definition in which the explanans repeats the explanon. And soon, von Neumann prophesied, the builder of automata will find himself as helpless before his creation, as we feel ourselves to be in the presence of complex natural phenomena. He added that the engineer of the future will not be the one who devises and designs a structure capable of fulfilling a function that has been assigned to him. For instance, construct a gizmo that allows 4 people to go from one point to another, and the engineer builds or designs a car. The engineer of the future will be the one who knows is successful when he is surprised by his own creations. Another word, more familiar to a philosopher, is the word self-transcendence. Complex means capable of creating something that transcends itself. Okay. Okay, this is I put the picture below is the von Neumann's grave in the Princeton. That's reference to his death. Okay. And here I want to introduce, I was asked by Fabrizio to say a few words about Hayek. So on the basis of von Neumann's conjecture, the conjecture is that such beings exist. That is, machines that are capable of producing something more complex than themselves. If that's the case, and I think we have good reasons to think that is the case, then we can derive from that an ontology that is at the same time non-substantialist, in this case, the case of life, non-vitalist, and not reductionist. That's a feat in a sense. That's a paradox, or because most non-reductionist theories of life, for instance, are vitalist, and vice versa. I mean, it's and how can we flesh out that idea? Well, by bringing together these two propositions that otherwise would look contradictory between each other. First, physical-chemical mechanisms are capable of creating life. There is no substance other than the usual substance studied by physics and chemistry in life. But two, life is and is actually infinitely more complex than the physical-chemical mechanisms that generated it. So the creation of life goes only one way. There is a lower level and an upper level, and the upper level is not reducible to the lower level that nevertheless, from which nevertheless it stemmed. And what Hayek was a good friend of von Neumann's, and they met several times in the same conferences in the 60s in particular on self-organization. Hayek borrowed that idea, and what I think one can describe his, what I call, that's my terminology, complex methodological individualism, resorting to the two following propositions. Individuals generate society, and however, society escapes them since it is infinitely more complex than they are. So there is a social level that is not reducible to the individual level, although it stems from it. That's a general idea. Of course, a philosopher cannot help thinking of Kant. I have to go fast. Oh, sorry, first, before Kant, an eminent member of the so-called Scottish Enlightenment, alongside with Adam Smith and David Hume, Adam Ferguson, very often quoted by Hayek, who wrote, "Social order is the result of human action, but not of human design." It comes from human action, but it hasn't been designed. It's an emergent, if you like to use another. Okay, today we know that complex self-organizing systems, and I see specialists of that on the list, David Chavalarias. Hello, David. Complex systems made up of many elements interacting in non-linear ways possess remarkable properties, so-called emergent properties, that justify their description in terms that one should have thought had been forever banished from science in the wake of the Galilean Newtonian revolution. It is said that these systems, that they are endowed with autonomy, that they are self-organizing, that their paths tend toward attractors, that they are path-dependent, that they have intentionality and directionality, as if their paths were guided by an end that gives meaning and direction to them, even though it has not yet been reached. As if, to borrow Aristotelian categories, purely efficient causes were capable of producing effects that mimic, simulate the effects of the final cause. And it's here that it's impossible not to mention Kant, who, by the way, lived in Königsberg. That was his city. He never left it, actually. And he certainly knew very well the 7 bridges. I don't think he had ever a wedding because he remained chaste all his life. And Kant's concept of internal finality in the third critique, and the second part of the third critique, which he called the critique of teleological judgment. Only explanations that ultimately appeal to causal mechanisms are adequate. Nonetheless, faced with the most surprising manifestation of complexity in nature or in life, recourse to another maxim of judgment, his vocabulary, and which he called teleological judgment, becomes inevitable. Concepts such as internal finality are perfectly legitimate, so long as you keep in mind that they have only heuristic and descriptive relevance. So teleological judgment consists in treating them as though, als ob in German, they have objective value. So if we had time, the first part of the third critique is about the beauty, and the beauty of nature in particular. So this is Monument Valley, so I'm not going to talk about that. So this is a way of representing, it was called by my late friend that a good many of you actually knew, Francisco Varela, the complexity from noise, and the mittens, as they are called, from the French word mitaine, looks like gloves without fingers, of Monument Valley are the result of such a process. You have a dynamics which seems to be guided by an attractor, which doesn't exist yet. Well, it exists in the future. And actually this attractor comes causally from the dynamic itself. The dynamics converges towards an attractor that is generated by itself. And hence the concept of evolution is said to be path dependent. Okay. Third and last part, design is back. Okay. Unfortunately. Almost finished. although it's the most important part of my talk, but this notion of natural machine has been highly unstable in the what I like to call, after Gregory Bateson, the ecology of scientific ideas, or in this case, the ecology of scientific concepts. It's very interesting here to compare the argument from design, supposedly demonstrating the existence of God, from the way evolutionist theorists say today. Let's start with the argument from design as fleshed out by David Hume in his dialogues concerning natural religion. But David Hume was not partisan of that. He has a character who fleshes out what the argument from design is. So let's just read we observe in nature a curious adapting of means to ends, which resembles exactly the productions of human contrivance, of human designs. Since, therefore, the effects resemble each other, we are led to infer, by all the rules of analogy, that the causes also resemble, and that the author of nature, the great maker, is somewhat similar to the mind of man, though possessed of much larger faculties proportioned to the grandeur of the work which he has executed. By this argument a posteriori, and by this argument alone, do we prove at once the existence of a deity and his similarity to human mind and intelligence. Okay, that was in the 1776. Now, a full-blown scientist today, confronted with the same complexities, will reverse the argument from design and conclude, quote, that there are too many things that just don't make sense if they were designed. If they were designed, then we should fire the designer. In other terms, if it were a designer, nature would have botched the job. Let me take an example here that I heard on NPR, the National Public Radio in the US, the equivalent of France Culture in France, if you, well, the French people here. So let me see. So it was an interview by the anchorman Michael Krasny on NPR. That was in 2008, of Neil Shubin, the author of a fascinating book called Your Inner Fish, in which he shows that many strange things in our bodies actually stem from the existence of genes that are still in our genome and that come from our fish ancestors. So, Shubin, we are not designed very intelligently, we are designed historically. When you look at the human body, you find bizarre detours and loops and turns and twists that make no sense. Nobody in their right mind would have designed a body like this. Michael Krasny, you mean God wasn't in his right mind? Ha, ha, ha. And Shubin retorts, the fish were in their right mind. For example, the spermatic cord in human males makes a weird loop around the pelvis. It comes from our fish ancestors. A really bad design. It doesn't say this proved that there was no design, resulting to the concept of natural machine. No, it says a really bad design. It was designed, but poorly, badly. One further step, and it is inevitable to ask questions such as, can nanostructuring, okay, I think I have that yeah, it's about the NBIC convergence. Can nanostructuring improve on nature's design? We can do better. Or Damien Broderick, in his fascinating book, strangely for us today, called The Spike, because we know that the spike protein plays a very important role in the current pandemic. But is it likely that nanosystems designed by human minds will bypass all this Darwinian wandering and leap straight to design success? Look at the contempt in this phrase, Darwinian wandering. So nature botched the job, but thanks to our capacity to design new structures, we can do much better. In passing, I can hardly fail to note the irony that science, which in America has had to engage in an epic struggle which never ends, to root out every trace of creationism, including its most recent avatar, intelligent design, from public education, should now revert to a logic of design, the only difference being that now it is mankind that assumes the role of what the Greeks called the demiurge, and that is the god fabricating the world, who made the world. But of course, all the critiques that have been leveled at the intelligent design paradigm, leading to the concept of self-organization, are even more pertinent in the case of human design. There is way too much information in the form of complexity in the organizations presented us by nature and life for a single mind, even if it is God's, to have been able to design them. If mankind strives to emulate a feat that God himself could not have achieved, doesn't it run the risk of playing the sorcerer's apprentice? But, and this is my last question, isn't that playing the sorcerer's apprentice the ultimate goal and the crowning achievement of the design paradigm? Those who want to make life from scratch must be prepared to create processes that will escape their grasp. That's what life does. Traditionally, the notions of design and control belong together. The new metaphysics associates design and out of controlness. A marriage, I'm saying in passing, that Heidegger could never envisage. And just, this kind of literature, popular literature, at times is very, very telling. So Kevin Kelly is a futurologist, if you like, with a famous book called The Technium, a book in progress, by the way. It changes all the time. It took us a long time to realize that the power of a technology is proportional to its inherent out-of-controlness, its inherent ability to surprise and be generative. In fact, unless we can worry about the technology, it is not revolutionary enough. So you see the precautionary principle, etc., puff, to the garbage bin. So, Descartes' dream was to, as everyone knows, becoming as masters and possessors of nature. The as is very important here. It's often forgotten, but Descartes was prudent. Design, which comes from the French dessin, by the way, which in the 17th century meant both drawing and goal, was synonymous with control. It means from now on, out of controlness. Just the last word, in Cauda Venenum at Heidegger, cybernetics is the metaphysics of nuclear age. He was completely wrong then, because he thought that cybernetics he was prisoner to the etymology of the word cybernetics, which was not very good. Teleological mechanism was much better. Cybernetics, gouvernail, govern, government, steering, etc. That was for him metaphysics of nuclear age, which was not a compliment, of course, because, as you know, Heidegger was a deconstructor of metaphysics. Okay, so my conclusion, the Sorcerer's Apprentice myth must be updated. It is neither by error nor by terror that man will be dispossessed of his own creations, but by design, paradoxically. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jean-Pierre. So we have lots of important topics to discuss in about 20 minutes. So it's it'd be
I stop sharing then, huh? Okay.
Yeah, we can. I mean, okay. So of course, this formally we will stop at 12:30. But then, of course, we're free to be here and to go on discussing. Of course, I mean, no problem. So let me start the discussion. Maybe actually in your paper, which I invite everyone to read. Of course, I mean to deepen a little bit the short presentation that you had to do. You end up with the question how to master mastery in some sense, and you quote Hannah Arendt. I mean, important points from Hannah Arendt, and I mean, if I have to sum up what I read, the problem is how to master, in some sense, our lack of mastery that comes from our ever-increasing skill in unchaining elemental processes. That you quote from Hannah Arendt, and this is from science, okay? And your conclusion, which is not very optimistic in some sense, is how we're going to set limits in the absence of any form of legitimizing authority other than our own free agreement, okay? And you say that this is the most important challenge of our times, and you have no ready-made solution to offer, of course, but I mean, I mean, if I try to sum up your argument, I would say that this metaphor of design is okay for a machine, and you quote Vico, we understand only what we do. But then cybernetics and the mechanization of mind through this NBIC convergence, okay, and the purpose of making life from scratch, this has developed an anti-humanist metaphysics that try to design the essence of mind with this idea of self-organization and out-of-controlness, okay? And now, I mean, so you see cybernetics as not very different from science, I would say, and then complexity science and cybernetics, I mean, having a big responsibility on this project, of course. And I would oppose that, and this was my point, to Andy's Pickering presentation last week of British cybernetics, which for him was quite opposed to science. So science was in framing, in Heidegger's terms, and while cybernetics had a poetic approach to the world, focused on open experimentations, and more symmetrical explorations also, you know, on the brain and the psychiatrics. And so I mean, as far as I can tell, you don't seem to see any, I mean, big difference between the scientific and cybernetic projects, at least they are both on the modernist side, I would say, okay, of and framing, I would put it in that way. While for Andy Pickering, they are quite opposed. Okay, so maybe it's not only. I mean, let me be clear. I'm not really looking for a historical point here. I mean, my main point is focused on the politics of cybernetics. Okay, because for Andy, in some sense, cybernetics infuses some freedom and open explorations and can be a promising ally, let's say, into the ecological crisis and a political ally. while your vision of cybernetics is not the same. So I would like to, I mean, and complexity science, okay, because cybernetics and complexity sciences today are linked, of course, logically and historically. So maybe I would like to open a 5-10 minutes debate on that with you and Andy, since Andy is also here, on this vision of cybernetics. And okay.
But Pablo, you know, there's a technical point here. Your voice, there are ups and downs. It disappears, it comes back. I don't know if I'm the only one to hear that.
Okay.
It's really...
okay, so my point, I'll try to...
No, I understood, but I had really to...
okay, I'm sorry. I'll
the computer and to the microphone too.
Okay.
Yeah, I got your point. So how do you see the discussion? Do you want me to say a few words, or?
Yeah, or maybe, I mean, what?
But yeah, I can say a few words. What I call cybernetics here, but it's a choice. Huh? It's basically the Macy conferences. Okay, and then the second order. That's a discussion with Thomas, maybe. Although I don't think it's, in my mind, I don't think it's very important. But second order cybernetics, founded by Heinz von Förster with his friends at the time, including Ross Ashby and many others, Design for a Brain, etc., etc. The story, the history of the BCL, Biological Computer Laboratory, in Champaign, Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, etc. Beautiful history, etc. I met Heinz von Förster in 1975. He became a great friend. He was a bit like you described Andrew Pickering's view of cybernetics. He was, he was anything but dogmatic or etc. And one of his major collective books was called Cybernetics of Cybernetics, as I said. Beautiful adventure. Yeah, but as I said in passing, for me, cybernetics was Warren McCulloch's really invention. And it was really, okay, you mentioned Heidegger, I did mention Heidegger, so let's continue a little of that. Along that line, what he was trying to do was really, and that's what I call the anti-humanism of cybernetics, showing that man is a machine, if you like. Okay, what I call the mechanization of the mind. And so it was a deconstruction of the usual view of man. Well, I'm using that term. It's that includes women, of course. Man's what Heidegger called the metaphysics of subjectivity. Cartesian and Leibnizian man, a man completely transparent to himself and who knows what he does, who knows what he's doing, no unconscious, no failure in what you do, etc., etc. And actually, I said, who are the French cyberneticians? The French cyberneticians were not the few people some of you may have in mind, who recommended themselves of the cybernetic traditions. No, they were the French structuralists and post-structuralists. Foucault, Lacan, Deleuze, Derrida, all these guys who became divinities in the French departments of American universities. No longer, that's no longer the case, fortunately. They all resorted in the 70s and 80s to cybernetic metaphors. It's obvious in the case of Lacan, who defined the symbolic, which which is in a sense the Freudian, the equivalent of the Freudian unconscious as, quote, the world of the machine. And he knew what a cybernetic machine was. Okay. And all these guys were claiming the death of man, as they put it, Michel Foucault. Okay. So what I call cybernetics, that's this tradition here, which is the opposite of an openness. So I may be too severe regarding cybernetics, but cybernetics was able to generate lots of branches and branches of branches, twigs, etc. You find it everywhere. So if you call all these things and bring them together cybernetics, okay, you have all kinds of things. I'm talking of the origin of the originary cybernetics.
So Andy, maybe time. I mean, do you want to protect? I mean, to protect your cybernetics and
no, but it's
yeah. I mean, I enjoyed Jean-Pierre's talk a lot.
I'm not hearing you. Sorry.
Oh, you're not hearing me.
The sound. Always the sound problem.
And
okay. Please.
Just.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Well, not really.
Shall I shout?
Okay, so please.
Are we okay?
Yes.
Oh, right. So I said I enjoyed your talk a lot. I'm never very sure how our conceptions of cybernetics relate to one another. So when you talk about out of controlness, not being in charge of technology, that reminds me of what I was talking about last week. Stafford Beer's idea of exceedingly complex systems that can always surprise us. And it might be interesting if you could talk a bit about somebody like Ross Ashby on the topic of design. He wrote a famous paper called "Can a Mechanical Chess Player Beat Its Designer?"
Yeah.
He had a very evolutionary idea of design, kind of trial and error with complex systems. And when he was trying to build a second-order artificial brain, DAMS, that was going to come after the homeostat, he didn't understand the machine that he built. And he developed this philosophy saying, well, I'll just mess around with the components. And if they move, if it goes in a good direction, I'll keep that, and then I'll mess around somewhere else.
Yeah.
And he said, if I'm lucky, I'll be like the explorer trying to find Lake Chad in Africa, who wanders around and gets completely lost and has no idea where he lives. But eventually he ends up on the banks of Lake Chad, and he's found Lake Chad, and he's got no idea where it is. Right? Yeah. This is kind of the evolutionary exploration of a very complex system. Is that the kind of thing that interests you, or that you're rejecting, Jean-Pierre?
No. You think I'm rejecting?
I'm asking you.
No, I'm not. I'm very, I'm a liberal in the usual sense. I accept many things. I'm a Popperian, so all kinds of ideas are good.
You reject everything.
Well, and then at the end, no. But where to put the frontier of cybernetics? I mean, it's it's
at least conceptually. I mean, is there some conceptual core that is common to this out of controlness and that Andy? I mean, this exploration, this open exploration. Do you think that at least conceptually it is inside, even in the US?
Okay. I would.
Different branches have explored different. Possibilities, but at least at the core of this is the core of cybernetics mechanistic, modernist? I mean, this is to me the core question. I don't have an answer. Maybe also
with more time. But okay, I spoke already too long. But more time, I would have taken 3 or 4 case studies this out of controlness as a goal. Well, first the NBIC convergence, but that's a huge thing. Huh? And within it, well, within it or outside of it, but what is called, that's a neutral name that doesn't scare anybody, but synthetic biology, which means creating life from scratch. Okay, and of course the editing of the human genome, the famous CRISPR, etc., etc. Yeah, but by the way, this is the current events. Huh? The current Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, anti-COVID-19, are the result of the synergy between the NBIC convergence and synthetic biology, because you have to put a sequence of an RNA that you made artificially, and that will produce the so-called spike protein I was referring to, etc. This is artificial RNA. This is synthetic biology, and it takes place at the nano bio level. So if it works, I hope it works. I will be hopefully vaccinated shortly, soon. I'm not sure yet, because there is, like in many other countries, there's scarcity of vaccine. But if it works, it's a beautiful feat. And is it cybernetics? Is it design? It's what? No. Once again, it's a paradox of the designing out of controlness.
Why? It sounds like just standard design to me. I mean, it doesn't remind me of cybernetics.
But Chris, how about the CRISPR, editing the human genome? You think everyone will use it as to design good things, to create new proteins that doesn't exist in the living world? Sooner or later, the temptation will be to launch, to...
Yeah, that's true. But the genome program is kind of classic modern science. Reductive, trying to find the sequence of genes.
That's what I call the temptation. I mean, if you create life, you want your creation to escape your control, in a sense. If not, you have not created life. In my paper, which was distributed, I quote the French literary man, philosopher of science, Paul Valéry, who wrote, and it was taken up by the excellent French philosopher of science, Canguilhem. Artificial life is not life, because it has a goal, precisely. And life has no goal, okay? So if you want to create life from scratch, you must not ascribe it a goal. The only goal of life is death, as we know. So yeah, I mean, it's
the point. I think maybe the difference between both cybernetics, as I see it, maybe it's that the open explorations that Andy describes have less grips that allow to control them, maybe. And then, I mean, the cybernetics, the US cybernetics, at the end, however, has some, I don't know, some grips or some degrees of freedom that you can control. And then at the end, it integrates the modernist project. This is a very intuitive, I mean, as I hear your presentations, I mean, even cellular automata. This is an example that opposes with Andy. Andy loves cellular automata, Neumann's And I don't like them because this is just fake out of controlness, because you know the rules. The rules are very simple. So, of course, you can derive the lesson that Adi derives. That is, okay, with very simple rules, you have things that you can, that just, I mean, are very, that you cannot predict, okay, very easily. I mean, they just surprise you. And that's true. This open exploration surprise you. I share that. But at the same time, you can use that in a reductionist way, as you use them, Jean-Pierre, saying, okay, it seems like it's open and it's exploring and it's surprising, but in reality, deep inside, there are rules. So I can control them as a modernist. So I think that there is something in that respect, but okay, we don't have much more time. I mean, I was puzzled by this metaphor of machine that you use all along, and which, I mean, it's really infected by the design. I mean, how, I mean, so, I mean, just to be clear, you agree that natural machine, the idea of natural machine is just not very, I mean, it's very inappropriate, okay?
Oh, no, I don't agree.
No? Okay.
It's the opposite. I take it highly seriously.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, that is a machine. Yeah, a machine without a designer. It's the it's. But okay, Fabrizio wanted me to mention Hayek. I just mentioned Hayek in passing, and actually, the important quote was not Hayek's, but Adam Ferguson. The social order is the result of human action, but not of human design. And Hayek, as you know, distinguished between, I forgot the vocabulary, I mean, between spontaneous social orders and what I think he called organizations. So organization, that's an artificial machine. There is a designer. It's designed with a goal to fulfill, but the great society, the Adam Smith, etc. It's, by the way, Adam Smith, but he can be forgiven. 18th century. Adam Smith's most famous metaphor, the invisible hand, contradicts what he was trying to say. There is no hand hidden backstage, as it were. No, it's purely spontaneous. So in the case of society, don't you admit this distinction?
But it's not a machine. Why do you want
to? Of course it is. Well, but if you, because you have in mind that a machine has a designer. Okay.
Yeah.
Replace machine with mechanism, for instance. The word mechanism is used by all of us for anything. When you have a chain of causes and effects, etc., it's a mechanism. That's what I call a machine. Not all machine is a Turing machine, to be sure, but nevertheless, the idea is there. It's the Turing machine. It's not a material object. It's an idea. It's a concept. It's a series of operations, sequence of operations. That's what I call a machine.
But I mean, seeing society as a machine in that sense is our point of view, and even life, of course. I mean, it's just one way of seeing things. And I mean, I don't see why we should take that as for granted. I mean, but, just useful for.
No, well, okay. This discussion is becoming.
Okay, but it's maybe we are going.
Terminology. Saying that it's. Sorry.
No. I was just asking people to ask questions on the chat, because we are already late, but it's, I mean, I don't want to I mean, if Fabrizio or Thomas actually want to enter the discussion or ask questions. I see that David has, I mean, he's
David Chavalaria certainly has
camera, so maybe he's okay. So if someone wants to ask some question, because we'll have a discussion on Hayek later in the webinar. Okay, I don't remember when. In February we'll have a special session on Hayek and complexity. Okay, so let's postpone Hayek's questions until then. So I don't know if David or Andy or Tom wanted to. Yeah.
David, we cannot hear you. It's the same problem as the last time. You should activate.
Your microphone is active, David, but we are not hearing you. I don't know why. That's strange. So, Tom, if you want to,
yeah, I would just. I'm not sure the boundary work, whether something is cybernetics or not, or whether we think it's cybernetics or not, that useful. We can think of another Königsbergian, Gustav Kirchhoff, in the 1700s, whose laws of circuitry David Mindel writes about a little bit in his book about cybernetics. And already then we have these kind of graph theoretical or tabular renderings of constrained physical systems. And I think that for me, the interesting thing about these ideas is the actual agency they had and have had in the world, rather than the ideation behind them. And I think that's probably why I find the historical method so important in looking at cybernetics, and partly why I find this California model so important, because I do think that fundamentally, under the contemporary approach to mitigating climate change, the rationales are cybernetic, but the level of rigor with which conservation savings or CO2 reductions are supposed to be accounted for doesn't really take place. And I think that that's the kind of if we think of Ron Klein's book about the mainstream of cybernetic thought in the 70s and its kind of diffusion into computer science and AI and machine learning, I think the diffusion of cybernetic thinking into energy policy is something that's not really been so discussed, yet is arguably more of great consequence.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so let me see. Okay, so David, now if you want.
David, yeah.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, now we hear you.
So I don't think we have time to explore this in details, but I think it is important to come back to the notion of complex systems as structure with many levels and scales, and life or in itself is like a huge complex system with different subunits. If we have the perspective of having machines, identifying machines inside this, then there is the issue of identifying contour or border of these machines and how they can change states. And I think this is one of the failure of the modern thinking, is that we think that, for example, we can act directly on nature and change the states of plants by just adding glyphosate, for example. But if we try to design design an action on nature that increase crops, then we say, okay, yes, it's simple. We put some glyphosate and next year we have a better crop. But we just forget that crop growing is a process, genetic process that require a lot of things, and also the fungi in the soil, the microbes, the worms. So we can control the states of this kind of, we call this machine like a plant that is growing for 1 year. But when we repeat this, then the yields are decreasing and we are just destroying the ecosystems. And then we realize that our system is not just the wheat or the crop itself, but it's just the whole ecosystem around it. And we cannot just act on this like that. So we cannot consider as a growing plant like just a machine on which we change the states by just adding some more or less pesticides. I think the same is with human mind. We just realize, so there is growing research on the role of gut microbiota, for example, on the human mind and humor and decision making. So this means that we have bacteria inside us that are deep influence of our action and what we do. So if we just say, okay, we are just machines and the brain is a machine and we have to study the change of the states, then we just neglect all these parts that it is part of a wider ecosystems. So the illusion of being able to design and act on complex systems is maybe an illusion of forgetting all the level upper and down that we don't consider where we design our action. And so I just want to have your impression on that, because I think it's really like a misleading attitude to think that we just can't forget all the irrelevant levels that we consider for our action, because on the long terms, there will always come phenomena that are emerging from other levels that will disturb an action. And this is one of the main reason of out of controlness of this complex system. So
okay, so thanks, David. I think that this summarizes, quite well the discussion. I mean, I think that you're going into, if I understand well, you're going in the direction, let's say, of Andy's idea of okay, exceedingly complex systems. Okay, Stafford Beers. And maybe the idea is that for these exceedingly complex systems, the machine metaphor, even natural machine, is misleading, because it gives us an impression of control that is unwarranted. I mean, that is not warranted by the what happens in reality. So the whole metaphor of control is misleading. This is maybe the way we could try to sum up everything. I mean, so if we want to have some concluding remarks, and yeah, Jean-Pierre.
If I may, maybe Jean-Pierre.
Jean-Pierre, yes.
I cannot hear.
Jean-Pierre, go ahead. Yeah, yes.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, perfectly.
It's decision that you made to bring together machine and control. There's nothing in the concept of machine that means control, except if you think that all machines have a designer and a controller, etc., etc. In physics, they use the phrase mechanism all the time. Huh? Think of refraction. I don't know. Okay, a ray of light that crosses the surface between the air and the water. Okay, and with a certain angle, everything occurs as if the ray of light were minimizing the distance goes for it from A to B. Okay, so there is an apparent finality. Huh? Principles of maximization are everywhere in nature. And you naturally use the term mechanism. Maybe it's just a question of vocabulary, but I in my own language, I don't associate automatically, if I can put it this way, automatically, machine and control. No, which presupposes a designer. As soon as you have the law of cause and effect, sufficient reason, as Leibniz put it, principle of sufficient reason, you have a mechanism. And nobody controls the ray of light.
Can I? Oh, wait, sorry.
Yeah,
can I say? Yeah. I've listening to you. To all of you. I thought that we don't understand too much each other, and a way to probably synthesize the debate that we have had so far is that probably we face four different. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Well, not so good.
Yes, it's okay.
That's strange.
Oh, okay.
Please go on. Please.
Different dichotomies, like for example, reductionist versus anti-reductionist, control versus out of control, non-autonomous systems versus autonomous systems, not surprising systems versus surprising systems. And so sometimes we tend to maybe conflate some of these terms with others of these four dichotomies, which probably must be kept separated the ones from the others, bearing in mind that each one of this dichotomy is not either yes or no, but it's a continuum. And if maybe we can build sort of a cube, three-dimensional cube, starting from all these four dichotomies, and all of the theories and actors and techniques that we have talked about, like first cybernetics, second cybernetics, complexity science, NBIC, Colorado River, and the Pickering's example, etc., can be positioned or situated in a different gradation, different points, sorry, according to its different gradation in this three-dimensional cube. So, for example, to give an example, an algorithm would be reductionist, maximizing control, non-autonomous system, and not surprising. On the other side, we could, for example, give the example of Pickering, Andy's example of the experimenting with the Colorado River. In that case, probably it's the other extreme, because this view, in my opinion, is quite anti-reductionist, because it doesn't presume of what we are gonna find or do into. So we do something, we experiment something, and we wait for things to happen. It's out of control by definition. It's an autonomous system by definition, and it gives surprise. But all the other things that we have talked about probably situate in what one or the other extreme, following the different dichotomies, and there are not mechanical correspondences. So a system can be out of control, autonomous, but not being surprising. No, maybe surprising, maybe, but you understand. So it can maybe cut these dichotomies with different degrees. And probably if we did some kind of collective work about this sort of cartographic work, maybe we would understand each other a little bit more. I don't know. This is just an intuition.
This is, Fabrizio, what I wanted to suggest. I mean, we were wondering with Fabrizio since the beginning whether to publish something, because this is the academic usual reaction, at least in social sciences, to publish something after a conference. And I told Fabrizio, let's go through all the seminars, and then we'll see if we can manage to draw some lessons, some general lessons, or some material from the conference. And maybe this is an idea. I mean, so for your compito, no, your duty for next Monday is to try to draw this complex geometrical figure where we can try to gather all these dimensions and see whether we can put all our speakers into this map, this complexity map. And then have some feedback, of course, because we are cyberneticians, have some feedback from the speakers and organize the discussions and map the different positions. It would be a nice project. So since I know you're never too busy, Fabrizio, you can do that for next Monday, and we'll see, because this is also to make the transition to next Monday, because next Monday we'll meet again. So I think it's a very nice experience to meet over 1 hour and a half every week like this to discuss these matters, and we'll enrich a lot the discussion going to some practitioners, actual practitioners. One is from business. So Michel Morgan actually started the Complex System Institute here in Lyon, inspired by Santa Fe, of course, and he now he's the head of Cosmotech, so like something like 50 people employed, by Cosmotech, from complexity research to business. So we'll see how complexity theory can go to businesses. And then David Valach is a professor in Sciences Po here in Lyon, using complex thinking in organization studies. So we'll have some more concrete examples after our philosophical discussions of today, more conceptual and philosophical, but of course they're also interesting. And we'll enrich our discussions about complexity thanks to these more concrete examples. So I'd like to thank a lot Jean-Pierre, Thomas, and Andy and David who participated to the discussion. And since our feedback is that when we are less than 10 participants, we stop the conversation because this is a feedback saying that it's already too late and time for lunch. As you can see, we have reached the magic number of 10, and maybe this is a good way to stop. And without, you see that there is not, it's an objective way of stopping the discussion. Okay, so thanks a lot. If and maybe a last word if you want, and then we'll go for lunch, and we can meet again next Monday.
Great.
Let's
Thank
do
you.
it for home.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
you very much. Goodbye.
Bye bye.
Andy.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Thomas. I hope we'll
See you.
meet
Bye, Thomas. See you.
really again. Not again, for the first time. Yeah.
For the first time.
Okay. Okay. So if you feel frustrated by the discussion, we start again next Monday. No problem. Bye bye.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Pablo, tu restes?
Oui.
Pablo? Ouais.
Oui, je peux rester, oui.
Bon, en fait, on est toujours enregistré, hein, donc il faut. Mais moi, enfin, c'est quand même un signe du succès.